flight to Shanghai, and Niamh is going to be giving us some contextual background information about Jewish refugees to Asia more broadly. Just some very boring points of housekeeping. We're not expecting a fire alarm, so if one does go, please follow members of staff out of the building, and the loos are downstairs in the basement. So let's check there was nothing else I needed to tell you all. No, that's everything. So yes, just to say this is part of our family history event series. There are other events online where you can watch YouTube recordings, so do go and have a look at those if you fancy. But I think, let's crack on. You're here to hear Niamh and Rachel speak, not me. So first of all, I'd love to invite up Niamh Hanrahan. Niamh is a PhD student at the University of Manchester, where she is working. She's studying humanitarian relief of Jewish refugees in Asia. And she's going to give us some background information about the topic. So, Niamh, thank you.
First of all, thank you, Elise, for inviting me. And thank you for Rachel for being gracious enough to share your time with me. Oh, I've changed slides already too. Excited. But yeah, so today my idea is to just give a general background to Jewish migration to Shanghai, to try and give some of the broader historical overview, which will hopefully try and give some context to the story that Rachel is going to speak more about, specifically to do with her family. Is the microphone okay? This way. So I thought I would just start with a kind of background to Jewish migration to Shanghai. I think it's really important to understand the different waves of Jewish migration that came into Shanghai at different points. So really, if we're talking about World War II Jewish migration or migration to Shanghai of Jewish refugees that was caused by Nazi persecution, this starts in 1933 when German Jewish, specifically German Jewish professionals, begin to emigrate to Shanghai. These would normally be people who were dentists or doctors who had a profession, would start migrating to Shanghai because they saw job opportunities and they saw more of a career progression and a place that they could live after the Nazi Party took over. I think it's important to note in 1933, these were not necessarily people with families. These were normally people who would move for their careers, and then their families could come afterwards. Whereas later on, you see much more of a large kind of family migration happening. So then in 1937, Japan occupies Shanghai, which is an important kind of world historical event to remember happening at the same time as this migration. And then in 1938 and 1939 is when the big migration to Shanghai happens. This starts mainly from German and Austrian Jewish refugees. And it's mainly due to the events of Kristallnacht and the Anschluss in Austria. This shows Jews that both mass deportation is possible, is happening, and an increase in the violence of Nazi persecution. So you see this mass movement of Jewish refugees from Germany and Austria to Shanghai at this time, and this is reflected also in what Rachel was going to say about her family as well. So you've got to think, like, in 1938, you have a couple of thousand Jewish refugees or a couple of thousand Jews living in Shanghai. By the end of 1939, you have, depending on the sources you're looking at, between 17 and 20,000 Jewish refugees in Shanghai. So you have this mass migration that's happening over quite a small period of time. From German and Austrian Jewish refugees. And then in 1941, you have a second wave, a much smaller wave, but a second wave of Jewish migration that's coming from Japan, which are Jewish refugees. And these are mostly Polish Jewish refugees who went to Japan, first of all, to escape Nazi persecution. And then in August 1941, were told by the Japanese military that they had to move to Shanghai. So then you have another wave of somewhere between 2,000 to 4,000 Jewish refugees who then come to Shanghai, who are mainly Polish. So you have these different, within this kind of wider idea of Jewish migration, you also have these different national groups that are moving at different moments for different, potentially different reasons. So I think that's important to remember. And yes, like I said, by you get to the end of 1941, there are, depending on your sources, because sometimes the numbers can change considerably, around 18,000 plus Jewish refugees in Shanghai. And then in 1943, in Shanghai, you have the Hongqiu ghetto, which is also called the Shanghai ghetto, is established in Shanghai, which is a designated area the Jewish refugees have to move to, or stateless Jewish refugees have to move to and live in within the international settlement in Shanghai. So that's a really, really brief background to the migration. I'm happy to talk about it later if anyone has any questions, but I think it's important to kind of get that brief overview of what's happening and who's moving when as well. So this is a really brief history of the history of Jews in Shanghai. So when those Jews came in 1933, they weren't the first Jewish people to arrive in Shanghai. There were already pre-existing Jewish communities. They were quite small, but they were there. And they've existed since the 19th century. So the first group was a group of Sephardic Jewish merchants, mainly from Baghdad, who came to Shanghai as merchants in the mid-19th century after the port opened after the First Opium War. So Shanghai was one of 5 treaty ports after the Opium War that opened up its trade. And so Sephardic Jews moved as a result of trade opportunities to Shanghai to keep this going and keep this up. I think the most well-known families who did this are the Sassoon family and the Kadoorie family. They're the families referred to in this book title here, The Last Kings of Shanghai. And it's really the Sephardic Jews. They're a lot smaller in number, but they are the people who, if you see someone benefacting like a school or a big aid group, they are normally the groups that are pushing the money into things. They're a smaller number, but there are people in that who are much more wealthy. You also have around 5,000 Ashkenazi Jews who mainly came from Russia. So they're a much bigger group. They also live in a different area to the Sephardic Jews. And the vast majority of these people came after the October Revolution in 1917 from Russia. And some of them stopped in Harbin. So there's different Jewish communities in China. The biggest is Shanghai, Harbin, and Tianjin. So a lot of them stopped in Harbin on the way, but some came to Shanghai. And normally these people were bookkeepers, merchants. They had relatively everyday jobs. And yeah, they lived mostly in the French concession as Shanghai was kind of split up into different international concessions. And most of them lived in the French concession there. So a question I get a lot when I talk about Jews going to Asia is, why did they go to Asia? So I thought I would just talk about that briefly there. So why did they go to Shanghai? It seems like a strange place for people a long way away from where they came from, a different language, a different culture. So for the Jews who came in 1938 to 1939, that wave, a big wave of German and Austrian Jews, the way I see it, or from what I can read in scholarship and what I understand, there are 3 big reasons that there was an existing Jewish community that they could use, which meant continued community and they could create community. They also had aid support from organizations such as the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee. So they had funding available at different times in order to go there. The big reason is until August 1939, no visas were required to enter Shanghai. So you could go there without having a visa, which, if you know the struggles of trying to get into places like the US and Britain, and people searching for visas and trying to get through that, the bureaucracy of visas, having a place where it has no visa requirements is quite an attractive prospect. And the third reason, and this also comes up in Rachel's book, is having evidence of onward travel to Shanghai and to other places as well, but in this case to Shanghai, allowed some Jews to leave Nazi Germany. So there, as we can see in Rachel's book, sorry if this is a spoiler for your book, Bruno Lowenberg in Rachel's family history was in Buchenwald, and he was allowed to leave because his sister was able to show that they had onward passage to Shanghai. And this can be seen in other passengers' accounts and testimonies that they were in a camp like Dachau or Buchenwald or other ones, and because they had a ship passage or a ticket to leave to go to Shanghai or other places, they were allowed to leave, because until 1941, the German policy was expulsion, was pushing more expulsion if it was possible. So that's the three kind of big reasons for the 38 to 39 big push that I can see. Oh, there you go. Okay. So within that, like I said, when I talked about there was aid supporting Jewish refugees migrating, one of the aid sources was diplomatic aid, and came from this man, Ho Fengshan. He was the diplomat in Vienna, in Austria, in 1938 and 39, and he signed visas. He signed visas for Jewish refugees so they could go to Shanghai. Also, that even if they didn't want to go to Shanghai, he would sign a visa that said that they would go to Shanghai so that they could leave where they were. Because, like I said, you didn't need a visa to get into Shanghai, but you did need to be able to prove that you had a visa to leave Germany or to leave different spaces. So Ho Fengshan signed an enormous amount of visas and was happy to continually sign visas for people so that they were able to either actually go to Shanghai or seem like they were going to Shanghai so that they could escape more properly. So I think he's an important figure to consider when we think about how Jews were able to get to Shanghai and why this route was available to them and why some of them used it. So I just wanted to talk a little bit now about that small group in 1941 who came from Japan to Shanghai. I'll confess as well, this is the topic that I'm focusing on at the moment in my PhD. So I know more about it, and I'm working on it now. So I have some personal interest in it, but I think it's also useful to consider these different movements at different times and why this is happening. So many Jewish refugees who came to Japan came to a place called Kobe in Japan. Some of them stayed there for a matter of days, some of them stayed there for years. And then in 1941, because of increasing tensions and because of Pearl Harbor, the Japanese military said to any Jewish refugees who lived in Kobe that they had to move on to Shanghai. So there was this mass movement from August to October in 1941, where Jewish refugees were asked or told to leave and to get the boat across to Shanghai. So one group, one quite well-known group is the Mir Yeshiva. So the Mir Yeshiva is the largest surviving yeshiva from Eastern Europe who survived the Holocaust intact. They did this through going through Japan and ending up in Shanghai. This is where they ended up in Shanghai. This is their house and where they studied. And they were one of these groups that moved on through this. And this picture on the other side is, I don't think you can see it very well, but it's a map of where Jews lived when they were in Kobe. Just to give you an idea of, it was between 5 and 25 people normally per house. And they were kind of spread out across the town. But yes, in 1941, except for people who I found some Jewish refugees who either had family ties or who found other ways in which to stay in Japan. But other than that, the vast majority of Jewish refugees who had spent time during the war in Japan then carried on to Shanghai. So I thought that was an important thing to point out. So when Jews were in Shanghai, what was life like for them? Like I said, they were in a very different space, but there were a huge amount of them there and a huge amount of German Jews and Austrian Jews and different nationalities that could come together and kind of form some sort of communities together, as is evidenced in Little Vienna, which I have a quote from Rachel's book up there in which Little Vienna is talked about. So Little Vienna was a space in which there were a lot of cafes and bars and restaurants, a lot of Viennese places, a lot of places that had been made by people who had come from, say, for example, Germany and decided to create a German bakery, or from Vienna and decided to make a Viennese cafe. And cafe culture has been written a lot about in Shanghai, and the way in which cafe culture created community, and people were able to meet up there and discuss there and kind of form a new kind of way of living through these cafes and meeting places in Shanghai. And really Little Vienna was at the center of that. Like the quote here says, you could buy Chinese food, you could buy European food, Viennese sausage, sauerkraut, soft liver dumplings. So even though it was in quite an unfamiliar setting, I think there are some things that you wouldn't necessarily think about that become very familiar because the people have brought their culture and their recipes and parts of their way of living with them, and kind of recreated that in a certain way in Shanghai. And this is just a photo of one of the bakeries, the Vienna bakery, to kind of show you an example of that. In terms of housing, the most focused upon kind of housing that happened in Shanghai is called Heime. It's housing for people who, so when Jewish refugees went to Shanghai, some of them were very self-sufficient and able to support themselves very well, and they're living, some had no money whatsoever, and some were kind of in the middle. There's a real range of experience. But for people who had very little money or needed a lot of aid experience, Heime were available for Jewish refugees to live in. And by the end of 1939, there were about 2,000 to 2,500 people living in Heime, which are these very small houses in Shanghai that could house anywhere from, I think I've seen maybe 6 people living in one to tens of like 50, 60 people living in one. So it can really range in experience. But a lot of the oral testimony that I've looked at and a lot of the accounts that I've considered always talk about these houses as being a part of the Shanghai experience. Even if you didn't live in one, you were aware of their existence and they were part of the kind of landscape of Shanghai as well. So those were the houses. And then, so alongside the cafes and the bakeries, and this kind of emerging relocation of culture, the entertainment life, the social life, and there were thriving newspapers and Yiddish newspapers, Bundist and Zionist newspapers, even though religious expression was frowned upon and not really meant to happen in a kind of subterfuge way. Zionism and Buddhism really carried on through in Shanghai, especially when in 1943, the Shanghai ghetto was established and people were kind of forced into this space. I'm not used to a microphone, sorry. Forced into this space. There was a lot of religious activity, a lot of religious newspapers, newsletters happening in Shanghai. And you can really see this when you start looking through archives and seeing that happening as well. So speaking of the Hongkou ghetto, so I think it's important to note that in academia, in a lot of articles that I've read, this space is always referred to as the Shanghai ghetto or the Hongkou ghetto. It's never, at the time, it was never referred to as a ghetto. It was always referred to as a designated space. As you can see, I don't know if you can, on the pass on the side, it's a special permission is given to the above person to go to yada yada from the designated area. So I think there's some interesting uses of terminology that have maybe changed over time as well. But as you can see, the sign there says stateless refugees are prohibited to pass here without permission. So stateless Jewish refugees in 1943 were told to move into this space in an area of the international settlement in Shanghai, and they had to ask for permission to leave if they wanted to. So the pass on the side that I just pointed out to you is a special pass to a rabbi student. So this is a member of the May Yeshiva, the group that I had talked about earlier, there's a lot of yeshiva passes because the group had to leave and come back for religious services, which existed outside of the ghetto. So there were a lot of passes for them. So there was this movement in and out of the space as well, but on the most part, it is a designated space that people were not meant to leave. However, there was no, I think you have to think of it not as a ghetto that you would it didn't have like barbed wire around it that would force people to stay in, but it was a space in which Jews, stateless Jews, were told that they had to stay in, and it was policed by Japanese military, who had to give permission for people to leave as well. So I just wanted to highlight, as a kind of aside, the work of humanitarian groups. As Elise said, my background and my work is in humanitarianism. So I just wanted to focus on 2 humanitarian groups that were doing work in Shanghai for Jewish refugees, and the way in which we can see this today in the archive, and the way in which it's evidenced. So the first is the United Nations Relief and Rescue Association. So UNRWA, as they're short, I'm going to call it UNRWA because we would be here for the rest of the talk with me just saying the name otherwise. These photos are from 1946. So they're from after the end of World War II. They're taken by a man called Arthur Rothstein. He's very famous for taking photos of rural America as well, but he was sent by UNRWA to Shanghai in 1946 to take photos of Jewish life there and Jewish refugees. These photos were publicized in newspapers and magazines. They were then lost. He didn't know where they were until the 1990s when they found them in a UN warehouse in Queens. So now they've kind of had a real life, and his daughter, who very kindly let me use some of the photos, has had a kind of really been trying to push her father's photography in Shanghai, and the interesting thing, like things that he took photos of. So I don't know if you're able to see it very well. The photo in the middle, that's very small at the bottom, is a photo of the outside of the Shanghai ghetto in 1946. The one in the top in the middle is of Jewish children in Shanghai. And then you have ones like everyday life of reading newspaper on the top left, your left. And then the bottom right are photographs of people looking at lists of people who have been found, people who are searching for people, and just general news bulletin information. And then the bottom left, you can see an example of Heimer, a house that's been kind of overcrowded as well. So I find these photographs very interesting. They kind of evidence the different aspects of Jewish life in Shanghai. They also show, and I'll kind of come to this briefly later, that even though this is 1946 and the war is over, Jews are still in Shanghai. They don't immediately move on to somewhere else afterwards. It's a real process. And Jewish life is continuing even in 1946 afterwards. So he's trying to show here, he's trying to evidence, the work that UNRWA is doing, the money that they're putting into Shanghai, and the conditions that they're trying to help, was the reasoning behind him taking the photographs as well. So the other group that I wanted to just quickly focus on is the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, or the JDC. So the JDC originally didn't want to help fund Jewish refugees going to Shanghai. This was a kind of broader consensus of people were quite wary about Shanghai as a place for Jews to go to at the start in kind of 1938, 1939. They thought that there were better places they could go to. It was quite dangerous, so they were quite unwilling to fund them. However, by 1938, 1940, the JDC kind of did a 360 switch and then became the biggest funder of aid in Shanghai. And by 1941, they were sending $30,000 a month to Shanghai to help people. So this is one of the aid workers. There were 2 aid workers who were principally working in Shanghai. This is Laura Margulis. She's the first female overseas representative for the JDC. She first went to Cuba, Then she went to Shanghai. She used her connections in Shanghai. The quote here, is her talking about using her connections with a Japanese general in order to get money to further help Jewish refugees, because you have the complication of, in 1941, the JDC is an American organization, and after Pearl Harbor, they become an enemy organization within Shanghai because the Japanese are controlling Shanghai. So the JDC funding gets cut off. Laura Margulis and her co-workers are still in Shanghai, but they need money. So the JDC say, okay, if you borrow the money from your contacts, then we will repay you after the war. So she uses her contacts to get money to help the JDC after the war. Laura Margulis is, I mean, her story is really interesting. She gets interned in 1943. She pretends to be ill, goes to a hospital where she knows the doctors, and is then transferred back to the US. But even when she's in the US, she's still trying to help people move on and move from Shanghai onto different places in the kind of post-war migration. So this is my final slide, I think. So yeah, moving on from Shanghai, like I said, I think it's important to understand that the end of World War II that we would understand as 1945, the war is over, is not as clean cut in, I mean, even in Europe, it's not as clean cut as that, but definitely not in Asia. People who are in Asia still have to contend with the Korean War, the Chinese Civil War. It's a period of constant conflict for people who remain in Asia. And especially stressful for aid groups when you have lots of Jewish people who then after the war want to leave, and they cannot facilitate all these people at once. So it takes a long time for people to leave. And as is seen in Rachel's story, some of her family members don't leave until 1947. So there is this like long, protracted movement, but the main places that people want to go to are the United States, to Palestine, to the US, to the UK, and some to Australia as well. So that's kind of the main push for people. And then, yeah, I just wanted to finish by saying there is a museum in Shanghai today for Jewish refugees. So there is some kind of remembrance as well. I hope this gave you a bit of a background, and I'm looking forward to hearing from you, Rachel. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Niamh. We're going to move straight on to Rachel's talk, and then we'll have time for questions at the end, if that's all right. So I'll get yours up now, Rachel.
Is it just into?
Yes.
I realised I didn't have to move the slides.
Move this so you can put them up there.
Okay, it's good. It's just,
yeah.
Let's go forward.
Okay, cool. I'll hand over to Rachel now. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Niamh, for that really good framework for setting the scene for what is now a kind of personal family story about all the things you've mentioned. And forgive me if there'll be a bit of overlap. Oh, I can hardly see over the top of it. If there'll be a bit of overlap, there'll be a lot of things that you've mentioned that come into the story. And thank you all for taking the trouble and time to come here in person. And thanks to all the people that are listening on Zoom. I don't know where to look for that, but anyway, thank you all for coming. So obviously, I'm going to talk to you about the book that I've been lucky enough to have published. It's called The Box with the Sunflower Clasp. The title will be obvious in a moment. And it's the story about my Jewish family's flight from Nazi-run Vienna to wartime Shanghai. Now, when I started writing, or had the idea to write this book, which was well over 8 years ago, it's been a long labor of love. I talked to lots of people in England, where I live, obviously, and nobody seemed to have heard of the Shanghai Jews. I know that people in Australia, America, and so on, Canada, know about this chapter of World War II history, but it seemed to me that very few Brits knew about the story. So that was my first motivation to keep going. I mean, I'd always wanted to write a book, and I had this wonderful opportunity to do it. The second reason was a much more personal reason. about my family's history. I wonder if I can just move this down a bit. Then I can see some faces, that's better. I wanted to discover my family's history. And you might say, well, why didn't you ask them? And there's a reason. I'll launch straight into the family, and then you'll see why I couldn't ask them. So, is it, oh, page, not end, page down. Oh, is it page down? It's a different arrow. That one, not end. Oh, I did end. Oh, it didn't move. Okay, maybe I was. Anyway, these are two of the main characters that motivated me to write this book. The person on the left is my aunt Lisbeth, and the woman on the right is my mother, Ilse. I couldn't ask my mother anything about her past because, as some of the people here know, because they're vaguely relatives of mine, she died a few months after I was born. So I never knew anything about her, really. My father wouldn't talk about her, but that's another story. Her sister, her younger sister, Lisbeth, was alive, and I met her many times, but she was a very uncommunicative woman. She would not tell me anything about her past life and her relationship with her sister. So I had to find out by something that Lisbeth left me. And I wonder now if she left me these documents, as I'm going to come on to, in order to discover her story, because she couldn't say it directly. And a lot of people who've experienced trauma and war find it very hard to talk about their experiences. So when Lisbeth died, she left me the box of the title of the book. I wasn't expecting it. It came in a piece of furniture that I had been expecting because I'd said I always liked it. And inside was this wrapped up box, old yellowing newspaper. And it was full of documents of very old things, way back before the First World War, right up, well, it covered quite a few decades of my aunt's life, things she'd obviously treasured and kept throughout her past. This was one source of information. I left it for quite a few years, but in 2012, I was given a book by someone who did know a lot about the Shanghai Jews, a historian in America called Steve Hochstadt, who published a book of 13 Shanghai refugees' testimonies. And the person who gave it to me said, look at the index. And when I looked at the index, lo and behold, my aunt's name was amongst the people there. And she had been one of the refugees who Steve Hochstadt had interviewed. And I was a bit shocked, really. She'd never, ever spoken to me about Shanghai, but she'd obviously opened up for hours to this, what I would say was a stranger. But here was her testimony, and I thought, well, maybe with all the things in the box, with help from, I did get help from Vienna Archives through a company in Vienna, maybe I can research with the testimony she's given, I can research and write her story and then find out more about my mother and the life in Vienna, who I never knew anything about. So, to go back to Vienna, to start at Vienna, Viennese roots. These are the two sisters again at the top. My aunt on the left, born in 1922, and her elder sister, my mother, born in 1918. So it's Lisbeth and Ilse. Here are about 3 and 7. They were the children of Edith and Arnold. Arnold had fought, like you mentioned, well, I think we've heard when I went on the tour, so many Austrians and Germans fought for the empire. He was a patriotic Austrian. He served in the cavalry. He considered himself Austrian first, Jewish second, but that counted for nothing. I should say they lived in Leopoldstadt, which many of you will have heard about from the Tom Stoppard play. A very nice area in Vienna. And after the First World War, my grandfather Arnold set up business with his wife. You can just about see the dates and the name Edith Epstein and Arnold Epstein. and it was a wholesale and retail parfumerie. And I like to think of it as a lovely shop selling beautiful things to make you smell nice, and brushes. And I could imagine it being a wonderful business. And they were doing very well until, as we know, everything changed. Now, if we've got time and if people are interested, I'll read just snippets from the book so that you can get a taste of what it's like. And this picture shows what happened and what took away their whole dream of their comfortable middle-class life in Leopoldstadt. Hitler wouldn't stay around, wouldn't let the Austrians vote in the plebiscite to say whether they were going to be taken into the German Reich. He stormed into Austria and in Vienna. This is what the scene that happened. I don't need to tell you, you all know about the Anschluss, but I want to give you a little personal flavor. A few days after the Anschluss, when Jewish actresses had been made to clean the lavatories of the Josefstadt Theatre, a 19-year-old girl was stopped by the Nazis on a street not far from her home. Barking out their order, they forced her to get down and scrub the pavement. With gritted teeth and burning cheeks, she knelt and complied. Disobedience was too dangerous. Her name was Ilse Epstein, in other words, my mother. That day, Ilse resolved to follow her school friend, a Jewish girl who'd already left Vienna for Paris. Back home in Am Tabor, she started packing her bag. She would not stay to be humiliated again. In a few weeks, she would be gone. I learned of this episode through one of my aunt's testimonies to another historian, not Steve Hockstadt, a historian named Patricia Kalman. As I read it, my own cheeks burned. This was not simply in anger at my mother's treatment. It felt so wrong to have stumbled upon such a significant personal event in the pages of an academic monograph. My ignorance of the life of the woman to whom I owed mine suddenly weighed heavily on me. So my mother left, she stayed in Paris for a year. She couldn't get a job. She came to England the following year in 1939. All the school friends that she'd gone over to be with were murdered in the Holocaust. It was very important for the Jewish men to get away. My grandfather's business was taken away, as we've discovered, you know. They were Aryanized, so as we've heard from Niamh. In May 1938, very soon after the Anschluss, these papers were found for me by a company in Vienna called Vienna Walks, and they'd gone through the Vienna archives, which is continuing to digitize its newspapers. So right until the very last minute writing this book, I was discovering more about my family. Quite shocking things that come into the book. Anyway, you'll have to buy it because there won't be time to tell you all of these things. But this is the form that my grandfather submitted to the IKG, which was the Israelitische Kultusgemeinde, forgive my German, it's very bad, the only organization that Hitler allowed to continue that would supposedly give support to the Jews. He later used it to get all the Jewish names and addresses, so he did use it for his own ends, but it did exist to help people get out. So my grandfather, Arnold Epstein, filled out the form, and at the very top, you can see his preferred choice was England, underlined twice, and he also had put down Brazil, Sweden, and USA. Well, he waited and waited and waited, nothing happened, but lo and behold, a year later, May 1939, he got a visa to Shanghai. And I'll whiz over this because Niamh's discussed Ho Feng Shan very well. He was later dubbed the Chinese Schindler and given the name of what is it, the righteous among, yes, because of his saving so many Jews. They didn't need visas strictly, but as Niamh said, it helped you get out of the country. I'm pretty sure that my grandfather was given a visa by this man, so my family owe him a debt. Niamh has talked about some of the Shanghai history. Why Shanghai? the Evian conference had shown that countries didn't want to take the Jews. They closed the doors to virtually nobody would take the Jews. The kinder transport was an exception. And I've heard of somebody on the tour that told me about another person called Kendrick that helped. But as far as I was concerned, at this point, Shanghai was the only place that Jews could get in. And one of the reasons was some of the turbulent history that, again, Niamh mentioned. This is a map in the 30s of Shanghai. I find the history absolutely fascinating. I didn't learn any of this at school. We were never told about the Opium Wars. Can't think why, but the time when the port was forced open by gun power, you might say, when in the middle of the 19th century, the Westerners forced open the treaty ports so that the Westerners could settle in Shanghai and make lots of money for themselves. And of course, the other ports, the other places in China. So this map is important for a couple of reasons, but the orangey area is the international settlement that the British and Americans claimed for their own in the mid-19th century. The place below is the much prettier and nicer French concession, which Niamh mentioned was home to an awful lot of the Russian Jews who had come over much earlier in 1917, the October Revolution. And in part of the international settlement was a place called Hongkou, which we've already discussed and is very important for this story for very many reasons. The reason I want this map, I want you to see this map again, is because Hongkou was massively bombed in 1937 when the Japanese invaded. They hit that area one of the hardest, and it was the site of terrible destruction, terrible hand-to-hand fighting. They called it the Stalingrad of the Yangtze, the battle for Shanghai in 1937. But that did mean that Hongkou was a pile of rubble, which meant it was very cheap and the refugees could focus on living there. It was much cheaper than everywhere else. So Hongkou plays an important part in the story. But there were two sides to Shanghai in the late 30s. Well, before 1937, it was a fabulous city of contrast. Cruise ships used to sail there. There was the fabulous Cathay Hotel that Victor Sassoon, one of the last kings of Shanghai, had built. The Sassoon family were benefactors helping the Jews that came later, but also changed the whole skyline of Shanghai. And this fabulous hotel, the Cathay Hotel, now called the Fairmont Peace Hotel, also plays a great part in the story. It's an amazing building and people have written whole books about it. But alongside this rich, lovely side where people sip cocktails, Noel Coward wrote his play Private Lives in that hotel, there was extreme poverty. And of course, there were a huge number, millions of native Chinese. We mustn't forget them, it was their place. But there was desperate poverty, homelessness, and alongside this Western settled city. I should have said it was the chaos of all the different rulers, the Japanese ruling the Shanghai of the Chinese areas outside the settlements, the British and the Americans and the French all having their own jurisdictions, meant that at the port where the ships deposited all the people sailing from Europe, because they came by boat, as you'll find out from the book, 4 weeks on a boat, ship. There was no one there checking visas or passports, and so the Jews could get in. So that was why that map was there. Right. I turn to my family now. I think this photo was taken in one of the gardens that you saw in that photo, probably the one at the end of the Bund, which is the embankment with the river. I'm showing you this picture because it's kind of so emotional in a way, because at last they were reunited after a year apart nearly. My aunt Elizabeth with my grandfather, and then again with my grandmother, who's obviously liked to dress very young and wanted to be considered just as young as her daughter. That's another story. But the reason I'm showing you the picture of my aunt is because when I knew her, she never wore a dress. She always wore trousers. But Shanghai had horrendously hot summers and bone-chilling winters, I should say. So she's here in a dress. And I want to point out that on her left leg, which is on the right for us, you might be able to see it's quite a lot more swollen and bigger than the other one. And all the time that I knew my aunt, she walked with a limp. She never, ever, ever talked about the accident that had happened. But I knew from rumour that it had happened when she was very young, about 15, in Vienna, before they left. Again, a secret that I had to uncover through my research for this book. And it was quite emotional and shocking, and showed that this very silent woman had once been a very passionate and emotional woman. So this is them. What did they come into? Niamh's mentioned that in 33 there were a lot of doctors and dentists. Well, this in 38, 39, it was also the exodus of what we call, I think Steve Hockstadt called the little people. They were not famous, rich, wealthy people, but there were a lot of white collar workers, doctors, dentists, and so on. In fact, there were so many doctors and dentists and opticians, they had to, this is the picture on the left, shows how they used the same office in shifts so that they could all share one premise and see different patients at different times of the day. This, I think, might be exactly the same picture that you showed. I wrote about the Heime as if they were refugee camps, because I saw them as the first camps that were set up in buildings that had been abandoned by the Chinese when they were bombed, and they were barracks and all sorts of buildings that were funded by the Sassoons and Hardoons and Kaduris, so that people with no money that came over in 38, 39 and even 40 could have at least a place to sleep. And I should say, I don't know if you mentioned it, but the Nazis prevented the Germans and Austrians from leaving with more than 10 Reichmarks, which was about $3. So they had to leave all their money behind, and they had to pay a tax to even leave. So the Nazis made a huge amount of money out of expelling all the Jews. I could go on. Sorry. Okay, so work. This is one of the photos in the box, and I just again love this photo. Kaduri, Horace Kaduri, one of these Sephardi families, had set up a school for the Jewish refugees. And again, there's lots of detail more about how that happened. But right in the middle is my grandfather. So from being a retail wholesale shopkeeper, he's now a history teacher. Don't ask me what his qualifications were. I have no idea. But I like to think he gave good history lessons, who knows. He looks a bit serious, and obviously he didn't seem to thrive very well, but again, you have to read the book to find out what happened. But these are his school children. My aunt had gone to a building in Vienna with my grandfather called the Urania, which is a beautiful building in Vienna, still standing. It's an observatory, but they allowed the Jews, Hitler allowed the Jews to go for evening classes to retrain. So my aunt learnt leatherwork, and she worked in a little cottage industry making gloves and belts. I'm going to zoom on to Hongkou and the spirit of the refugees that came over. I would use the figure of about 20,000 as being the numbers that were there. I think that's fair now. So an awful lot of them could only afford to live in the rubble-strewn remnants of what had happened after the 1937 battle for Shanghai. And this is the Jews, who I have never thought of as being famous for their muscle power, but I may be wrong. There were lots of architects, engineers, and draftsmen, and they rebuilt from the rubble a complete streets and buildings to make themselves a better home, which became known as Little Vienna. And they, as Niamh said, they really wanted to keep hold of their culture, their food. My aunt, I know she wrote in one of her one of the interviews, no one liked to eat Chinese. She said, well, we love it, but obviously we're different. They didn't. So they tried to recreate all the cafes and the cake shops and the chocolate makers. Because there was a French concession, there were some extremely good French chefs that were poached for these guys to to come and make chocolates for these new refugees that came in. This picture shows Café Louis. It says Louise, but it's a misprint. And Louis Eisfelder and his wife set up this cafe. His son, Horst, was a young man, a teenager, who figures in the book because I actually went and met him and interviewed him, and he took so many photos of what was going on at the time that it's a wonderful source. He's brought it really to life. His photographs are amazing. And he's written a book about his experiences. Sadly, he died this year, but he was about 95. Anyway, so this is just a few more pictures showing Little Vienna. And you can see the Western dress alongside the Chinese people. The Jews completely rebuilt this huge marketplace, which they called the Markthalle. It was a complete skeleton, and they built it back up. And there you could buy all the strange meats and dangling things. They talk about scrawny, blood-dripping ducks and all sorts of things. But, you know, they couldn't keep kosher. You just had to survive. I think pragmatism came over piety in this situation. And if you didn't have much money and didn't want to go to the cafes, you could buy potatoes from street sellers, and you could buy the coffee grounds, coffee that's been made out of 3 sets of coffee grounds from the posher restaurants. Everybody managed to survive and to enjoy life. Well, that's another story. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is the culture was very much kept up. At the other end of the scale for restaurants and so on was the White Horse Inn, which was named after the Viennese opera, and it was run by 2 Viennese people. And Niamh mentioned newspapers. It's not just the food, the music. They carried on with, they put on theatre productions. They were so creative. These 20,000 were considered one of the most creative communities in history, almost, with what they were doing in terms of plays, operettas. And one of the people that I want to mention set up the first library, lending library, for the refugees. He was a refugee that will feature in my book, that features in my book. He had owned bookshops in Paris and Berlin. He was very short because he had scoliosis, which in those days was called on his passport hunchback. This height issue is important. If I get time, if I'm allowed to overrun a bit, we'll get to in a minute. But the height thing is not me just being height, it's because I'm really small. It was important for his well-being later. I think I've skipped, yes, I've skipped a bit, but he was sent to Buchenwald in June 38, and through his sisters getting him a ticket to Shanghai, he was rescued. He set up a bookshop which was in the main international settlement. It was on the corner of Bubbling Well Road, and I originally called this book The Bookshop on Bubbling Well Road, which I really liked, but it got changed by the publishers, but that's fine. And he didn't just have a lending library and a bookshop. He made this, and this is, I guess you've read Japanese Nazis and Jews. So this is his bookshop's mentioned in this very seminal work by David Kranzler on this period of history. And Bruno's Lion bookshop was considered a mecca for teenagers, for refugee teenagers who'd lost, I mean, they'd been ripped out of their schooling, they'd had years of trauma with the Nazis, and now they were being given lectures and talks and sort of social events run by people who were refugees who'd worked in architecture, in newspapers, in theatre and so on. So it was an important part of the Shanghai Jewish experience. Now, the story, of course, he and my aunt met. They actually were neighbours on the same street, Yang Terrace. I realised I was going to read another little bit. Can I? Does anyone have to rush off? Oh, well, they're not going to answer. I should read a tiny bit. They lived in Yang Terrace, and I read a tiny bit about what life was like for these cultured Jewish people who'd grown up in Vienna. Yang Terrace, where both Bruno and Lisbeth's family lived, was in a lovely gardened area with 8 houses, and it had 2 entrances. One of the entrances was on a road called Yates Road. At the top of Yates Road was Love Lane. Lisbeth avoided walking there after dark. As its name suggested, it was the settlement's most well-known brothel district. Another no-go area for the 18-year-old was Rue Chu Pao San in Frenchtown, a short street off Avenue Edward VII, near the French Bund. Its countless bars and clubs attracted crowds of sailors, soldiers, and prostitutes. Alcohol-fueled fights were so common that the street was known as Blood Alley. A British soldier described it as a thoroughfare entirely dedicated to wine, women, song, and all-night lechery. Those drawn there, easy pickings for thieves. The contrast with her home in Vienna was remarkable, but Lisbeth grew accustomed to her wild new city surprisingly fast. She knew it was rife with gambling and prostitution, but later said that she never saw any opium. Lisbeth Epstein's new city had one thing in common with Nazi-run Vienna. The value of life was dependent on one's race. Here, it was destitute Chinese people, not Jews, whose lives counted for nothing. In 1933, the bodies of more than 5,700 Chinese beggars, indigents, stillborn female infants, etc., were left on vacant lots for collection and burial by benevolent societies. What killed them was never stated, only this total, recorded under the heading exposed corpses. Thousands more deaths went unnoticed. In Shanghai, there was no compulsory registration of deaths. To her horror, Lisbeth soon saw this for herself. She learnt to walk carefully to avoid the small bundles wrapped in newspapers and placed on the pavement, the tiny, stiff bodies of Chinese infants whose parents had no money to bury them. So that was just to give you a feeling of, you know, what a shock and how quickly she had to adapt to this new world. But she met her neighbor, Bruno, who had the bookshop and lending library. She obviously didn't want to carry on making gloves and leather belts and so on. And she asked him, when his assistant left, if she could work for him. And so a new chapter of her story began. Everything was fine until, I say everything was fine, it's a sort of euphemism, but we all know what happened in December 1941. Suddenly, their world was turned upside down again. At the same time as the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor and entered the war in the Pacific, entered World War II on the side of the Nazis, at the same time, Japanese troops entered Shanghai to take over all the territory of Shanghai, which was now including the foreign settlements, which had so far resisted their rule. And they flew their flags, that's right, on the Bund. That's probably from the top of the Cathay Hotel. Niamh has mentioned what happened to the Jews. They were terrified because suddenly they were again in a city ruled by allies of Hitler, because the Jews were on the Axis powers, as you know. And this is a map of the so-called ghetto. As Niamh said, no one called it a ghetto then. And in fact, it's important to say that the Jews at that time didn't know what was going on. They didn't know about the ghettos in Europe at all. Newspapers were so restricted, it was only later on. There was no barbed wire. There were exits and entries, and as Niamh said, there were passes for people who either needed to study or to do religious services, like the yeshiva students. School children could go in the Kaduri school, where my grandfather had been teaching, was outside the ghetto. And I should have said that this was the result of the proclamation in February 43, and every Jew, well, they were not called Jews, they never mentioned the word Jews in the proclamation. It was stateless refugees. That only counted the stateless ones. The only stateless ones were the ones that had left after 1937-38, when their citizenship was stripped from them. So the Ashkenazi Jews, the Russian Jews that were already there, were immune. They didn't have to go. And that was another source of conflict between these two Jewish communities, which had been going on for quite a while. That's another story, but that's explored in the book too. In fact, some people thought that the Russian Jews had colluded with the Japanese authorities to set up this ghetto. Whatever, it was for stateless refugees, and it was a designated area. So what happened to them? The people in my book, Bruno had to leave his lovely library on Bubbling Well Road, or near Bubbling Well, and he set up another library on Ward Road, which I put a little arrow to. It was a lovely Mandarin house with glass and ornate wood. So that sounds odd, but he just took up the hall and he lived behind the library. So he had a screen. And also on Yang Terrace, he didn't even have a room. He just had a balcony off a room. That's where he lived. Space was so tight. And my family moved to Chusan Road, which was right in the heart of Little Vienna. They lived in the Czech Club, which they got through my grandfather's having been born in what was then Czechoslovakia, in Bohemia. So that was a benefit of his birthplace. I'll quickly, this is coming to the very end. I think I've done about as much as you. Fair's fair, right? Niamh said they could get passes to leave the ghetto. Bruno had to get a pass every month. He had absolute nervous breakdowns before every time he went to get the pass from this man who was called Kano Goya, who called himself the King of the Jews. And he used to ask children, he'd give them sweets if they could answer, what's my name? And they'd have to answer the King of the Jews. He was the man in charge of the ghetto. He could be completely unpredictable and capricious. He would slap people, he would hit them in the face, he would stand on his desk and scream at them, or threaten to throw them out of the window of his 4th floor office. But the reason I'm telling you about Bruno here is Bruno was very short. Kano Goya hated anyone taller than him. Bruno was never slapped or threatened, but was terrified, and it brought back all his nightmares of Buchenwald. And this is his pass. Niamh showed a pass. So this is his showing where he can go. And it says owner of library. And on the other side, it showed the districts of Shanghai, that the streets he was allowed to go through to get books. And I think I think I've come to the end of the slides I'm going to show. I'm ending with, I've just given you a flavour, I hope, of the book, of the research I've put into it over the sort of 6 years of writing it, the personal and bigger history of the Jewish people, whose spirit of endurance and enterprise I think is incredible and hasn't been told in much. I don't think it needs a wider audience. So I hope this has given you a flavour of these themes of the book, and that if any of you want to buy it, there are a couple of copies at the back there, and this is it. So thank you very much.
Thank you both so much for that talk. I don't know about you, but I found it really useful and interesting to have the historical context and then have it so sort of beautifully personalised as well. And I've read a copy of the book, and I would recommend getting hold of it if you can. I think we can still open, obviously if anyone needs to dash off, do feel free, but if there's any questions that people have, and people online, if you can type in questions as well, I think. But if there are any questions in the room, give me a shout and I can come to you with a microphone. And I can start, which I'd quite like to do. So you both mentioned this drive by the refugees to sort of recreate the tastes of home, in particular the recipes, the cafes, the chocolate shops, all that sort of thing. Is there any sort of lingering evidence of that today in Shanghai, do you know? Hang on.
Well, I could just give you a very concrete example in that some of the streets, in one of the streets in Hongkou, you can see very faded adverts in German for the cafes, which is quite chilling, really. You have to know where to look, but they are very, very much there. Yeah. So at least 2 adverts on the walls about a few things.
I was going to say about echoes. I think as if you know where to look for, there are things there, and also in the museum, it's also been highlighted, like the spaces as well. But I think if you're looking for it, you can see it, but otherwise it's probably faded a bit. As far as I know.
They're preserved now.
Yeah.
The museum is important too. Someone might want to know about the Shanghai Jewish refugees.
Yeah, I was going to follow up with that.
Oh,
Yes,
okay.
no, I was going to ask you. I don't know about it. So I was going to say, can you tell us more about the museum as well, please?
Well, when I first went to Shanghai in 2004, I think it was, there was no museum, but Shanghai is such a modern, amazing city now. They have bulldozed so much, but they're now working to preserve what's left of Hongkou. Oh, sorry about that.
No.
It's okay. They're working to preserve that part of their history, and they're actively promoting links with Jewish people. And this wonderful, one of the synagogues has been converted. I think it was about 2011 or something like that. And so when I went in 2017, it was there. It has, it's recreated from original things that were left by the Jews, rooms and artifacts, suitcases, and the stories of different individual refugees. And my aunt's was there. I was totally surprised that her story was there. And there's a beautiful, huge memorial, about like this width, but way longer, to the end there, with the names of about 13,000 Jewish refugees that were recorded to have been saved. A number of them didn't want to give their names to the Japanese authorities because they thought this was going to be another list that was going to get them into trouble, so they refused. But and I saw my family's names on that thing, which was very moving. It's a great place to visit if you ever go to Shanghai.
Any questions in the room? Yes, one sec.
Could you say a few words about the end of the war and the breakup of the ghetto? Presumably no combat, but what happened to the residents after the Japanese surrender in Tokyo Bay in 1945?
I knew that someone would ask me the real history question. It would be someone I know. No, I mean, the Jews immediately, they knew about VJ Day, I think you call it, don't you? After the appalling but end of war droppings of bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Jews went to Goya and the other people and said, well, now, you know, we should end the ghetto, but they didn't. They didn't end the ghetto. It took many more months. That was in August. It took quite a while before the ghetto was dismantled. Well, I don't understand how it could have carried on, but apparently it did, because until the Americans came in, and again, I can't remember exactly when they came in to relieve Shanghai, but they did. Yes, it went on much longer than anyone had hoped, but see what Niamh has to say about that.
No, I think it's also important to note that I think it was July 1945, the Americans airbombed the ghetto. So there was an airstrike on the ghetto and some Jewish people died. A lot of Chinese people died.
By mistake.
We think, yeah. No one's really sure. But so there was this constant stress that fighting and conflict was continuing even up right to the end of what we would see as the end of World War II. There is this conflict still happening. And like you said, it goes on a lot longer than you would necessarily think. There isn't a clear cut. There isn't an idea that, okay, you know, Japan has surrendered, now we're going to open the ghetto. It's a bit messier than that. And I think some of that is to do with the context, the fact you're in Asia rather than you're not in Europe. So I think there's lots of factors that come into that, but it's definitely messier than maybe you would think about.
Are there any other questions in the room? Oh, one sec, I'll come through.
Yes, hello. We have two questions from the online audience. One is from Elaine, asking if, do you know anything about the group of Polish Jewish refugees who came to the UK as part of a diplomatic exchange, Japanese in Europe for European in the Far East?
I don't, but it sounds interesting, so I'll look into it. So that's given me some good interest. No, I don't know. Do you know anything about it?
No, the only thing I knew about the Polish refugees was when the very religious ones were in the yeshiva were told they had to move into the settlement, and they refused, and they conducted a protest and threw furniture out of the Japanese authorities' offices, which I thought was very feisty of them. And if they had moved into the building that they'd been designated to move into, they would have died because it was bombed. It was completely wiped out by the bomb that you mentioned in July of 1945, July 17th, 1945, which again is a chapter in my book because my aunt was clearly part of that. Yeah, so sorry.
Okay, and other two quick questions. One from Kumiko asking, what is the estimated number of people who came to the UK from Shanghai after the war?
I don't know.
I don't think
Very specific question.
Shall I answer that?
Yeah.
I think it could be counted on one hand because they were all taking ships to the west coast of America or to Australia or to Canada. They wanted to go to English-speaking countries because I didn't make clear that the lingua franca in Shanghai, but since the days of the settlement, was English. And so they'd learned English. They were forced to learn English. In the Kadoorie school, Horace Kadoorie, being a British-born Jew, I think that's right, he refused to let them speak German when the German Jewish children, and they all had to learn English, and they learned it very fast. So although they could have come to the UK, as far as I know, they didn't. And that's why I felt I could write the book, because nobody seemed to know about, you know, the link. And my aunt went to America, and so that's how I only ever visited her in America. Yeah, she never came to England.
Just to follow up, I certainly agree with what you say about the Shanghai side of the Jewish refugee story just being so under-known in the UK. So it's fantastic to have had this event to sort of try and start raising the awareness a bit. And as you said, there's obviously so much more research potential in the story too.
Yes, and George, also from our online audience, is curious to know what happened to the King of the Jews after the end of the war, if you're aware.
Have you, I know a bit about that. I can start and you can add.
Yes, yes.
Do you know, he apparently genuinely thought he was a friend to the Jews, because at some point times he condoned, he let them leave for concerts from the ghetto, and he gave the children sweets. He did some good things. And when he went back to see them after the end of the war, he was very surprised that a gang of young Jews beat him up, beat him senseless, knocked him to the ground. And he said, but I never killed anyone. I never killed anyone. And he didn't get it. He didn't get that he was so hated. And he's a fascinating character. In a way, there could be a whole book about him, because people called him a psychopath. And he was greatly interested in music, and he played the violin. And he insisted that the best violinist in the ghetto taught him violin. And there's cartoons that have been preserved that show him shouting at the violin teacher, "You beat my rhythm, Professor so-and-so, or I will kill you." You know, I mean, he was completely, he was a great sensitive lover of music.
There's just a real disconnect between.
Yes. And some people have even suggested he might have been a spy. Have you come across that one? Yeah. So can you add anything to that?
No, I think it was just good that you pointed out that there was this disconnect between what we can now see his role as being and what he saw himself as his role as being, and that they didn't quite connect. So even though we might say, oh, you know, he was horrible, he didn't see it that way. So I think that's important to note. Yeah.
I mean, not having ever killed someone is a very low bar for being a decent human being. Like, I think most of us have passed it. Well done us. And yeah. Any more questions either in the room or? Oh yes, here we are.
So what happened to the Chinese diplomat?
Ah, I don't know.
Oh,
Sorry. 2 minutes.
he was recognized by, is it Yad Vashem, made the,
Righteous among the
I
nations.
never can remember that, righteous among the nations. He lived to a very ripe old age, and he lived in San Francisco, which was the same place as my aunt. So I have speculated at the end of the book about another character in the book living to his 90s. He lived to his 90s, as did someone else in the book. And I think he and another character in the book would have got on very well and had a similar compassionate, humane philosophy. And his daughter has been spreading his story, telling his story. So I think he was a wonderful man who lived a long and happy life, is what I feel.
I think he had, from what I've read at least, a lot of conflict with his superiors over what he did. And that after he was thrown out of his role, and there was a lot of, anti-feeling towards what he did. So it wasn't,
he risked his
yeah.
life doing it, didn't he?
So it wasn't smooth sailing. He didn't kind of finish the war and then go straight into this kind of happy future. There was a lot of turbulence in that. But I think, like you said, it's interesting how it connected at the end with your story as well.
Oh, yeah, one more question.
I was just going to ask, you've mentioned that obviously there's individual characters that have helped the Jews move to Shanghai, but how did the kind of general population feel with this sudden influx of these, like this foreign group of people into their communities?
Do you mean how did the Chinese feel about them coming? That's a good question, because, you know, it wasn't an economically happy, strong place after the conflict, and they could have felt incredibly threatened by all these 20,000 people vying for places and jobs and work. But from what I've read, and Niamh can follow up, I feel there was at the minimum tolerance, and on the positive side, actually, there were some good friendships made. There were even some intermarriages between Jews and Chinese. And I think what changed the whole attitude was the Jewish response to this bombing of the ghetto in 1945, when hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, I can't remember, hundreds of Chinese in very crammed Hongkou, where the ghetto was, were badly injured and killed. And the Jewish people rushed to their aid and really helped them. And according to reports, the Chinese doctors didn't, which is, you've read that too, it's quite shocking. And the Jews didn't, the Chinese thought that everyone would be expected to pay for treatment. And as they were being dragged out of the rubble, or their leg was being amputated, they said, how much do I need to pay you? And the Jews have said, well, don't be ridiculous, sort of thing, I'm going to save you. And that apparently was a huge flip, even more to compassion towards the Jews. So I think they didn't resent them, but they got even more pleased with them after the response to the bombing. What would you say?
No, I agree. I think that it's an area of this topic, this understudied topic, is an area within that has been understudied, because I think when you're looking at Jewish refugees in Shanghai, there hasn't been that much of a focus yet on Chinese voices within that. So I think it hasn't been as studied as it should be. I also think, like Rachel said earlier, there was a real push in terms of visas, in terms of your life after the war, for Jewish refugees to learn English, not Chinese. So a lot of these Jewish refugees could not speak Chinese. And from what I've read, a lot of them had no interest in learning Chinese. So this communication in a lot of ways was not there, because there wasn't a shared language. But like Rachel said, I think it changed over the course of the war, and different events may have helped it and didn't help it. But I think it's important to remember these kind of connections and disconnections that are there as well.
If there's time, I just remembered one anecdote that, well, one aspect of the interaction was that in some of the fancier Jewish run restaurants, there was a rooftop garden restaurant where there was music played and Viennese type food served. The Chinese waiters learned enough German to be able to ask for orders and provide the right meals. So it went that way rather than the other way. And I think that the Chinese waiters enjoyed that interaction, as far as I can see. Anyway.
Okay, I think I think it's a good sign that we've kind of run over, but it's such a fascinating topic, and we could talk about it a lot longer, but just in the interest of time, I think we might have to wrap up now. So I just want to say thank you so much again for your time and for the effort that you've put into the presentation and for talking to us and answering the questions in such detail. So yes, can you please join me in thanking our speakers today, and thank you all for coming as well.
Oh, that's a bit ghostly, isn't it?